With the ongoing wave of journalists essentially leaving their major media conglomerates and starting their own YouTube channels, their own Substacks, their own streaming pages, I wanted to dive into the financials of one of those companies that essentially went independent. No, they didn't go independent from the media company. They went independent from another creator-based conglomerate, for the lack of a better term. And I want to dive deeper into their revenue side, into their expense side, and talk about some of the lessons that we all can learn, especially if you are considering starting a more broad media company based on your kind of like creator brand. So from the perspective of who we're looking at Second Wind. If you're not familiar with Second Wind is essentially an offshoot of the former editor-in-chief of The Escapist and a bunch of their journalists. You probably have seen Escapist content in the past. They were especially pretty big in the gaming space and just some of the pop culture space 5-6 years ago or so. They've kind of like hit their stable line and have been at it for a little while until about a year and a half ago when there was a little bit of drama. The editor-in-chief got fired and a lot of folks just simply followed him and created Second Wind. So that's as much of a context you need to know for them, but for general perspective, it's essentially a few folks who kind of like comprise the leadership, and I would say up to a dozen of total employees between the editors, and you're looking at different kind of like support group, producers, and anyone who is kind of like on the writing staff. So decent group of people managing primarily the entire business of Patreon. So if we're gonna jump quickly kind of like into their breakout, they do these super helpful financial reports every quarter that kind of like give us a lot of visibility into what the heck is actually happening. Looking at their very first report, which was technically Q1 2024, a few things to kind of like read through, right? If we're looking at the income sources, first and foremost, you have YouTube, comprising kind of like off of AdSense and probably some premium viewers. You have your Twitch, comprised of very likely some subscriptions and some chat donations. You have your Patreon, which is their primary source, standing at $200,000 per quarter. So, right, roughly around considering the fact that it's a quarterly report, about $70,000 per month at that point in time. Then you have $5K for merch. You have the sponsors of about $62K, which is not too bad, makes it about $20K a month. And then you have donations and I guess some random income of about $6,000. So all in all, you're looking at about a little bit north, right, of $320,000 between all of these income sources. And when it comes to the expenses, obviously you start looking at the salaries and the freelancers being the biggest one, which very similar for a lot of companies, right? Like if you ever manage P&L for any company, your headcount is usually your biggest line item. And from that perspective, unless you're an inventory-based company, your inventory there might be a little bit higher than headcount. But traditional SaaS and traditional media companies, headcount is always the biggest line item. So you have about 170K, some business expenses, which can be a setup and other kind of like miscellaneous items of 6K, software and equipment of another 10K, and there's some travel, 23K, likely to the events and different kind of like places where they can conduct some of their work, and some legal incorporation stuff. So all in all, they net out positive of 100K, which was very strong start to the entire enterprise. Now, something you will see as we're going to go through the rest of the filings, so to speak. This is the very beginning. One of those things that you have to consider if you are thinking about starting kind of like your own brand, your own company, you have a creator brand already established and you have the audience that follows you, you will always have that initial successful pop. Physical products, digital products are the same. Any kind of like new service, people want to support you. They want to be out there. They're curious. They want to try things. Never assume that this is how things will go, because things will change over time and things will dip and kind of like, go up and down. And you will see it through some of these other reports over the past year where you have to be prepared and you have to always take into account the fact that that first month, that first quarter of your revenue will always be an outlier and always be a positive outlier. So always consider the fact that things kind of like, will taper down and kind of like cool off from there. And this is what we'll kind of like start seeing as we jump into the second quarter of 2024, where you see kind of like YouTube remaining at the same, Twitch remaining at the same, Patreon kind of like, moving in a steady state. So still remains kind of like pretty hot, but no longer 70K per month. Now we're looking at more like 55K per month, which is again, amazing sum of money, but consider the fact that you at least looking at about a dozen people working there, with sponsorship kind of like upping up by about another 10K and the rest of it remaining at the same levels. Now the salaries jump up heavily. In the last quarter, if you recall, it was about, I think, 170. Now it jumps up by about 50K, which is not unreasonable. The way Second Wind kind of like went through the entire journey, they on purpose kind of like agreed to not take full salaries in the first, I think, couple of quarters, if I recall correctly. The first quarter that we looked at was technically, I think, their second quarter on the record fully. So they had a few months as they were setting things up that essentially no one was taking salary, only taking like partial salary to make ends meet, pay mortgages and some basic expenses because they left their prior employer. So because of this, now you see an uptick in income, in expenses. And that's one of those other downfalls where you have to be thoughtful of if you slowly kind of like wind up the operations and you add more people working for you. As the revenue tapers down and the excitement tapers down, your expenses might go up. You will have that point where you start getting very close when it comes to your break-even point, right? So you have to be cautious about that. And obviously they had to pay taxes, which was a big outflow of 50K at that point in time. And all of a sudden, on a net basis, now they're actually in the negative. They spend 13K more. Arguably, because of the taxes line item of 54K, it's not unreasonable. If you remove that, they still kind of like 40K positive. But now you're starting to take into consideration, okay, I'm slowing down on my revenue, I'm increasing my expenses. I have to start thinking through what are my next avenues and where can I go from there. And in the notes section, you kind of like start seeing Second Wind talking about some of the conversations about the sponsorships, thinking about new revenue opportunities from the podcasting side. So they're also recognizing the trend and they're starting to look at other ways by which they can kind of like make up the delta and make sure they don't dip into the negative, because they have this war chest that they created of about 200K and now it's already down to 180K, which is again, substantial amount on the surface. But if you look at the line item for like salaries, expenses alone, they only have about a quarter worth of salaries in the company, in the war chest left, right? So it's something to be mindful of for the young company like this. And then when you look at the Q3, you start noticing YouTube kind of like losing at least half of the revenue, which is, again, not completely surprising for the Q3 of the year, right? Summer and kind of like beginning of the fall is not always like the hottest on the AdSense. December is coming up, right? Like Q4 is coming up, and that's where you expect to pop. But also you can argue that depending on the content flow, depending on some of the things that they're doing, it can change. Twitch we can ignore, still too small. Patreon continues to drop off. Right now we're at about 150K, or we're just actually 146, so we're right under the 50K per month. And this is one of those important considerations, especially when it comes to like Patreon and membership type things, right? Again, because of that excitement, why the revenue tapers out, because a lot of things, in many cases, when folks hear you start something new, and it's especially based on the membership type revenue, they will be excited and they will support you in the first month. They don't want to commit with so many other subscription services and being afraid that they're going to forget about it. They are concerned about starting completely new subscriptions. So what many folks do, instead of paying you, say, $5 for the next 12 months, right? They will just go put the subscription up at like $50 on Patreon to make a one-time payment and then cancel it immediately. Like, so they give you the support instead of the full, monthly payment that they might get and they might forget about. One-time payment and they're out. And this is where you can get excited because you're on a membership platform. You're like, oh my God, I got so much. Like I have this person signing up at $50. So I have now $600 worth of revenue forecasted for that user. No, you really just tapped out the entire annual worth of revenue in a single month. So from the expense perspective, and especially from the revenue forecasting perspective, it's super important for you to consider those kind of users. And that's a quite common thing on Patreon. And then again, merch is kind of like still being relatively slow. Sponsors slow down, right? So we went from like 60 plus K of about 20K per month down to now looking more at like 40K. So you're right around like 15K per month revenue. So definitely a dip there. And again, coming back to the expense side, right? Like the salaries kind of like maintaining themselves at about 240 to 150K. And you have some of the freelance work and some of the other items, likely taxes is only 7K, which likely was just a true up. But coming back to overall kind of like the balance sheet, or I guess P&L, you now have an extra 40K dip in your war chest because they overspend by 40K. And basically all of it really comes from the fact that their revenue is behind likely their target. And I don't know if from the initial planning perspective, because I don't recall them making any comments on this, if they just made the mistake of assuming that, hey, the way the Second Wind started at the very beginning with like 340 or so $1,000 in revenue, this is where our line should be, and they planned all of the expenses against that. But clearly, their like income right now is not keeping up with where their expenses are. And you start seeing them kind of like starting to consider potential for higher work, which is not unreasonable for the media company, more merch ideas, a potential fundraiser, which is again one of those things that I've heard from plenty of folks who manage their memberships, where you kind of need to remind people why they should be excited about your Patreon and about your membership site. So you always want to almost like every year or so retool and refresh your membership tiers, what is included in every tier, and never take stuff away, but more like add things or just reshuffle things a little bit to bring some energy and excitement into it. And then also from the perspective of potential like fundraising activities, that gives you an opportunity to remind people like, hey, I have a Patreon. Maybe some new folks joined you in the last year, and that's their opportunity to come in and kind of like start helping you, make up for that loss in revenue, if that's the same situation that you're facing compared to kind of like second wind. And that kind of like brings us now to the Q4. And this is where I would find a couple of things that were a little bit concerning. Q4 is usually the highest on the AdSense, and you should be expecting kind of like increase and more energy around, all of your content, and more advertisers coming in and wanting to sponsor you. But both their YouTube and also their sponsorship dropped. Like their sponsorship took a beating, which to me, when you compare those two, you compare and yet another drop in Patreon by another like 20K per quarter. I think a lot of these from the perspective of the income, just overall seeing at least another like 10-15% of your revenue dropping in Q4, in the quarter where you're supposed to expect kind of like things to pop up, right? Because of all the ad spend. This, I would argue, is more of a macro. So there was a little bit of drama. We can skip it. There was a little bit of drama within Second Wind with one of the main creators within it. Absolutely normal, right? Especially when you throw in a bunch of creators in the same group, and they kind of like in that environment where, hey, you kind of have to work really hard to now make up for like not having necessarily full-time employment. Now it's all on you, and the content can get tough sometimes if it's underperforms and someone feels like they're being shortchanged. Enough of kind of like all of that. We can set it aside. That's not the topic of discussion today. But there was a little bit of that, right? So that influence, and kind of like some of the fans of that creator who left obviously left as well. So you can kind of like see that as a dip. But from the macro perspective, coming back to that, this was the quarter where people start really talking heavily about the, downturn in the economy, potential recession, or what is happening, people losing their jobs. By then, now we're through most of 2024. A bunch of people are continuing to get laid off. So it's absolutely normal that you start seeing dip in the Patreon, because subscription is one of the first things people should be canceling, right? If you kind of like got laid off, or you have some contraction in your income, and you as an individual want to maintain your budget. And then from perspective, I'm like looking back at the sponsorship, right? Like the sponsorships dipping down so low. And also YouTube can be the fact that brands are just not interested in spending as much. And that was the case. A lot of brands at the end of last year and still throughout this year, they're very conservative when it comes to spending cash on advertising. They really want to spend on like confirmed true bets, if at all, right? Because a lot of the companies right now, a lot of CFOs are trying to kind of like buckle down, stay on top of their cash, and just ensure they don't overspend in the environment that can fluctuate and change at any point in time. And plus, you had, especially in the United States, you had the election season, so elections took place. There's uncertainty about the change between now two completely different and opposing kind of like parties. So that also throws a lot of things into, the entire situation. So because of this, the reason why I wanted to bring those things up is that one of those considerations you have to make as a creator is, especially you start thinking about, hey, I want to form an actual media company. I want to start thinking about how it's going to work, and I'm going to have employees, and I'm going to have a revenue. Predictability of the revenue is a thing, nothing new to you as a creator, right? You already have that situation, kind of like with AdSense, some of the other platforms that you might be using to monetize, where you know that things are not as stable. But when you kind of like move into the direction of actually becoming a company, and now you have dedicated clients, and maybe they're brands, right, or larger corporations, you are now also at the mercy of all the macroeconomics effects. So this is the time where you kind of like, as a creator, as much as you want to ensure you remain on the creative side, and maybe you have someone, on the business side helping you with some of those things, I would strongly suggest that you should start, reading some stuff, staying on top of the economic environment, just understanding what's happening, because you're now a business leader. And as a business leader, you need to understand what's happening in the world and how it might potentially affect you. This is an important consideration. And this is where we kind of like can clearly see it among all the other things in the Q4, which you would expect to be a much bigger quarter, but it's actually saw even further drop in the revenue. So one of those important considerations to make. And now walking into the last quarter, so the Q1 of 2025, YouTube kind of like remains the same at steady state, which is actually a good thing because you usually see a drop off, right? Like Q1 is famously like heavy drop off. You like celebrate and pop champagne bottles as a creator in Q4, and then you're eating, I don't know, salami sandwiches for the rest of the Q1, right? Because of how tight the numbers might be. But revenue stayed the same from the advertising perspective. Sponsorship popped up a little bit more, which is always great. Also can be a factor of the fact that a lot of sponsors like to jump in on it in Q1, since they know that so many brands kind of like leave the space and they don't advertise, they don't get too much funding to the Q1. So for a lot of opportunistic, smaller, younger brands, that's a great time to go in and buy some ad inventory because it's usually much cheaper compared to the Q4 or even Q3. And then you look at the Patreon, and Patreon actually did pop finally a little bit. They did a little bit of fundraising at the end of Q4, so kind of like helped bring it up, but definitely didn't bring it up to the numbers that they saw in the Q1, which was like, close to $250,000. Now it's still kind of like right under 50K per month, so right under 150K for the quarter. Expenses stabilized a little bit, but it also was due to the fact that they start looking at some of the adjustments. They likely took a little bit of a pay cut across the board, across the team, cut some freelancers, right? Like they've done as much as they could to maintain the expenses. And they also talk in the comment section that they are ensuring that they're rebuilding the momentum, right? They're focusing on the revenue side of things and not traveling. They're not spending things as much as they would have in the past because they're still 10K in a negative when it comes to specifically this Q1. And this is where kind of like when you look across the board on these revenue line items, the expense line items, one of those things I just want to call out to say is that there are a few takeaways from something like this. Like first takeaway, right, between the memberships, AdSense, and sponsorships, they all will fluctuate. So you always have to consider diversification. You might say, hey, Tahir, you already mentioned 3 different revenue streams. Like that's a diversification if I've seen one. And yes, it is a diversification, but you still have to continuously think about depending on how much of a runway you have and depending on how much of like recurring expenses you're going to commit yourself to, right? If you have an office space, if you have multiple different employees, if you're considering different like expensive subscriptions for some data sources or software tools, things that will help you in your production, you have to respectively start thinking about, okay, how can I ensure I have a stable revenue, right? Between not only the memberships, the AdSense, the merch, but also maybe digital products, some other resources, maybe again, side project work, things that can help you supplement your revenue. And the easiest framework that I would say to think about it, consider that the more complex and your expense side is, right? Like, so the more factors you have when it comes to employees, software tools, things of that nature, the more complex your revenue side should be. When you're on your own as a creator, AdSense is enough. So it's very nice and simple, right? Like if you're a creator plus you have some expenses, you start taking on some additional revenue, right? From the perspective of maybe you started the membership, started sponsorships, things of that nature. You hire an editor, you need to go double down on some of these things, right? Like, so the more complex your expense side is, the more diversified your revenue side should be, because again, you don't necessarily have like a SaaS company annual recurring revenue where you fall out of bed, assuming you renewed like 80% of your client base, you still know exactly how much you're going to make in cash. So as a creator, you have a little bit more of a, up and down situation. So you always have to consider it, especially if you're starting a media creator brand. And then the other part of it, speaking of a little bit of the drama, right? Like the public perception will affect your funding. And it's an important consideration, right? Especially if you are in the space of media, if you're in a space of where you might cover some controversial topics, right? And that perception and reaction of folks to the topics you discuss may actually boost your popularity and boost your revenue potential, or might really tank it, right? So this is one of those things where, again, software companies and some of the other companies that more less personable do not have to worry about it. But because as a creator-led company, your creative face is kind of like attached to the brand, how you behave externally, what kind of things you say, who catches you saying what on a hot mic, can really be beneficial or detrimental to your business, especially if you're creating a media company around your brand. Even if you try to ostracize yourself a little, like in the case of, again, them moving from escapist and kind of like creating Second Wind, and then one of their key creators kind of like leaving, the key creator leaving still takes certain part of the audience with them because that's who they really enjoyed watching or following. So this is one of those things that you have to really keep in mind based on the team that you're assembling, based on the kind of content you create, and again, based on your own personal behavior and the kind of persona you've created outside of the brand. Because if you already created a very controversial persona, anticipate the fact that it's going to be very challenging for you to maintain a very stable income for the brand that you build because of the fact that you might be more at higher risk, kind of like individual when it comes to brand sponsorships, when it comes to even potentially some of the memberships that you're going to acquire. And then from that perspective, you cannot underestimate the importance of the war chest. You have to ensure you have set aside X number from all of the different revenue sources that you have towards a potential point in time where you won't have as big of a performance, or you will actually start losing revenue, right? From the perspective of all the different things that you're doing. Again, war chest is there to help you make through tougher times, but it's also one of those ways to create a safety net in case you want to actually on purpose try to reshuffle certain things, right? Like change the way you approach memberships. Maybe you start or stop certain brand sponsorship relationships. That gives you flexibility. And as you saw with kind of like Second Wind, their rule of thumb, it looks like they're trying to keep at least quarter worth of expenses, which I'd argue is like very razor thin. And ideally you would have something like close to 6 months, because between deal making, the process of actually selling ad slots, between maybe like recreating or creating new types of content, I would say 3 months is a very tight deadline. 3 to 6 months becomes more reasonable, especially when it comes to like, internal approvals that potential brand sponsor might need to acquire to go and ensure that they can pay you. Or maybe as you're trying to reshuffle and create a new type of content, creating it, testing it, creating more, testing it can also be a time-consuming process. So that is why I would say target, if you can afford it, up to 6 months in war chest, because that will give you a lot more flexibility to shift things around, or in case there's a downturn in the economy. And finally, when you start thinking about, okay, but how do I then balance that against some of the investments? I would say it really depends on the kind of content you're trying to create, but I would always say the war chest is more important than potential short-term gain from some additional funding, right? Like you buying Red camera versus regular Sony camera will not make as big of an impact, but those like, extra 20 grand that you're going to spend on a more fancier camera can actually make a difference if, again, there's tougher times and you need extra 20 grand to continue to pay a couple of your editors while you're figuring things out and you get another deal done. So from the perspective of the content creation, especially around the creator brand, a lot of folks are there for you. They're your fans, that they want to hear the kind of information you have to share. So because of this, if you're trying to create a real media company about it, don't overcrank on the expenses. Don't go all hands on deck. I'm going to hire 20 people. I'm going to have a studio, and within the studio, I'm going to have like 8 Red cameras, and it's going to be all fun and dandy 4K streaming live at all times, right? Like that's silly. Unless there's some real specific reason why you would do that. Keep it tight, keep it on the budget, ensure you have a war chest, start planning for some fluctuation in your revenue, and always, always, always ensure that you do not plan based on that first month or first quarter pop that you're going to have in the revenue, because it will always decrease from there. And you always need to assume that things will taper off and they'll stabilize a lot lower, at least 20% lower than that top line. If you can be more conservative, go to like all the way up to maybe 50%, because I'd rather you have some extra revenue you didn't expect that you can put in the war chest, or maybe go invest somewhere, than be in a situation when you overcommitted yourself for like annual expenses that are thousands of dollars above what you can actually realistically make in revenue. So this was an interesting example, and I want to give big kudos to Second Wind. Again, it's a tough job. It's a tough waters to navigate on your own, and especially when you're trying to create the brand, but they've been doing a lot of good work for the past like year and a half. They're really working hard on ensuring they stay in touch with their audience. And I love these financial reports because they give you a very interesting insight. I link down in the description below kind of like their page. You can actually go and read some of this stuff. I think it's important for you as a creator who is potentially considering creating their own media company. It's important to really think through, okay, what my P&L would look like, right? Like profit and loss statement. what it might look like, what are the things I need to consider. Hey, will I be able to reach the same brand sponsorships or same level of like AdSense? How does that translate then to my expenses? And then how does it translate then to my actual profit or loss each quarter or each month, depending on how you're going to manage your business. So again, super useful. They get the major credit. I was just really wanted to talk through it for a little while now and just realized like, hey, now I'm sitting on a good year worth of those statements. So it can be fun to look back and analyze, which I'm again very thankful to SecondWind for being so transparent with it. I hope this was useful. If you have any questions or comments based on what you saw, if you have some like things and ideas that were inspired by this discussion, drop them in the comment section or reach out directly. I love talking to the creators about their business strategy and kind of like all the operations behind it. So always happy to just go and spend like 30 minutes, an hour, just brainstorming around the stuff that you're working on. Otherwise, I'll see you next Saturday. Peace.